This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times no matter when.
So welcome to the 16th century, and we're going to look at a lot of familiar paintings, but I'm going to try and take you behind the scenes so you understand kind of what art historians argue about and discuss and foment. And I'm also going to show you some of my all-time favorite images, like the one you're looking at, but we have to wait a little while to get there. And probably share some, I've talked about that image before, but sometimes there's some surprising revelations that have been uncovered in relation to Renaissance images of women. And I'm looking forward to sharing even some new ones I've discovered, always finding out new things. All right. So we ended last week approaching Leonardo. And as I've said in other classes, Leonardo is a groundbreaker. He transformed the way people, but particularly women, the way Renaissance individuals were represented. Most importantly, he turned them around. But what I've been reading recently was kind of discovering how important Verrocchio's studio, where Leonardo trained. Verrocchio had the largest studio in 15th century Florence, and he's most known as a sculptor. And the legend goes that in his baptism of Christ, where Leonardo probably painted an angel, Verrocchio never picked up a brush again. But what's interesting is you're going to see the influence of sculptured portraits. And as you'll see, when you have a sculptured portrait, it's in the round. So it, in a way, automatically turns the figure to look at the audience. So Leonardo was trained in Verrocchio's studio, and we're going to compare his first portrait of Ginevra da Benci to one of the Verrocchio portrait busts in a little bit. But first, we're going to talk about who is this person, why is she so significant, and how has she been altered over time. She's in the National Gallery in Washington, and we know from Vasari that Leonardo painted Ginevra d'Amerigo Benci wonderfully. Now we also know Vasari made mistakes. So Vasari telling us that Leonardo painted Ginevra, maybe that's true. Is this Ginevra is the other issue. And I think we're going to resolve the issue that this is Ginevra, but I'm going to take you inside to see some of the issues around it, particularly one where a scholar still argues that this isn't Ginevra. So what were the circumstances of the commission? Piero da Vinci was the father of his illegitimate son, Leonardo, and he served as a notary for the Benci family. And very likely, his association with the Benci family led to this commission. More importantly, even, Leonardo was friends with Ginevra's brother, and Giovanni. And in fact, when Leonardo went to Milan, left Florence and went to the Sforza court in Milan in 1482, he left his unfinished Adoration of the Magi, which is in the Uffizi today, with Ginevra's brother, Giovanni da Benci. So we know that there is a close association between Leonardo, his father, and the Benci family. So that makes sense, right? That the Bencis would turn to Leonardo. In 1474, Ginevra was married to a much older man, Luigi di Bernardo Niccolini. And Luigi was an important Florentine. He was elected Gonfaloniere of Florence in 1478, and later he was a prior of Florence. These are government positions, highly significant in Renaissance Florence. So for years, it's been proposed that this was commissioned to celebrate her marriage to Luigi di Bernardo Niccolini. The problem is this doesn't really look like a marriage portrait because none of those elements that we looked at last time, jewelry and fabrics and display of wealth are shown here. Now, we're also going to look at several other Leonardos, and Leonardo did not like fashion accoutrements or kind of fancy fashion. So it's totally possible that this is because of Leonardo's attitude of what makes a woman beautiful and not to distract from her inner and outer beauty by fashion. So he might have made the decision to subdue the display of wealth. Or it's also possible that it was commissioned by her family, probably not her father, but her brother, and they were all members of the Medici Circle, the Neoplatonic Academy, friends with Marsilio Ficino, who translated Plato for Cosimo de' Medici. And in fact, through the Benci, Leonardo was introduced to Florentine humanism. Leonardo didn't read Latin, but if you hang out with the smart guys, you pick up what they're thinking about. And the other clue to this being a woman named Ginevra, of course, is the bush behind her head, which is a juniper bush. And in Italian, or particularly in the Tuscan dialect, juniper is either Ginepro or even Ginevra. So the inclusion of that bush behind her head seems to indicate that she would be named Ginevra. But as I said, the argument against it being about her wedding is its lack of the traditional elements of a marriage portrait. And Leonardo says, do you not see that among human beauties, it is a very beautiful face and not rich ornaments that stops passers-by? And this I say to you who adorn your figures with gold or other rich trimmings, do you not see beautiful young people diminish their excellence with excessive ornamentation? So that's a very strong argument and he said it more than once. I just gave you one quote, strong argument on the part of Leonardo's involvement in making decisions about how he depicted the women he portrayed. In addition, we talked last week about sumptuary laws, and in the 1470s is the time that they became much stricter. One wonders whether the Medici just didn't want other people to compete with them in showing off their wealth. And in fact, women in the 1472 law were restricted to no jewelry except for 3 rings and 1 brooch. But we have to remember that these sumptuary laws were passed frequently and hardly ever enforced. So, and often people like the Medici were exempted from them. So there's another possibility, which is peculiar to Renaissance Italy. And we're going to meet Bernardo and then later his son Pietro Bembo as these intellectuals and diplomats who espouse this concept of Platonic love, which comes out of Petrarch and was discussed frequently in places like the Neoplatonic Academy. So Bernardo Bembo was the Venetian ambassador to Florence twice. He lived in Florence between 1475 and 6, and again in 1478 to 80. And he was very close to the Medici circle of humanists and Neoplatonists. And he supposedly fell madly in love with Ginevra, not sexually, but platonically, and commissioned 10 poems by the Medici circle of humanists, 6 by Cristoforo Landino and 4 by Alessandro Braccasi, to eulogize his love for Ginevra. It is with these flames and with such love that Bembo is on fire and burns, and Ginevra dwells in the midst of his heart. That's an excerpt from a Landino portrait. And in addition, Lorenzo de' Medici dedicated 2 sonnets to her. And so here's the question. Did Bernardo Bembo commission this portrait? Or did the Bencis commission this portrait? Or was this commissioned for her wedding? And I need to remind you that outer beauty in the Renaissance was believed to reflect inner beauty or beauty of mind. And this wonderful quote under the title, I ask your forgiveness and I am a mountain tiger, is the only evidence of reports that Ginevra was a poet. And in a letter from a friend in Rome, he asked her for her poetry. And the only line that we have, at least that has been discovered, is this one. I ask your forgiveness and I am a mountain tiger. So when you look at this portrait, I want you to think about, what does it mean to be a mountain tiger? And I ask you also to think about how revolutionary this portrait was. You saw the profile portraits last time, and now we're looking face to face into the eyes of this woman who is looking rather sadly or sternly or seriously at us, asking us really to think about what she's thinking, to kind of welcome us into a dialogue, which is utterly new. You can't speak with a profile. So here are some profiles here. So in the circle of Lorenzo de' Medici, there was this creation, both in poetry and in painting, of a new type or new image of a woman, not as a bride or a wife or a daughter, but this amatory possession of a powerful man. And this was inspired particularly by a woman who died in her youth in 1476, Simonetta Vespucci. And she was famous in Florence for her beauty, for her elegance, for the fact that Giuliano de' Medici, the brother of Lorenzo, was her platonic lover. Very strange concept. But it goes back to the chivalric celebration of love and women's beauty. So this was a new topic that was discussed. And I think, you can imagine these guys sitting around writing, competing with each other, writing the most beautiful poetry about the most beautiful women, and choosing women in the city of Florence to whom they can dedicate their verse and compete over how to praise these beautiful women. And this woman, Simonetta, was the most famous of these Platonic beauties. And there are a whole series, 5 or 6 portraits of her, you see 2 here, that have been attributed to Botticelli and kind of decided that these are really workshop portraits, not by the hand of Botticelli. But if you look at these faces, you're familiar with Botticelli's most famous paintings, these faces reappear. And we're going to see that artists, are going to reuse their beloved or women that they choose as their models. So all of Florence was in love with this Simonetta. And what is particularly fascinating about these images of Simonetta, not Ginevra, is this kind of focus on the hair. Now, hair is a very complicated issue in the Renaissance, and I think goes back to antiquity, but particularly to the Middle Ages. Hair is this image of kind of women's allure. It's provocative and dangerous. So Simonetta was this focus of Giuliano de' Medici. And in the Medici jousts of 1469 and 1475, which were dedicated to Simonetta and to Giuliano's coming of age, but also more importantly, to celebrate an alliance between Florence, Venice, and the papacy. And Bembo was in Florence for this joust, which was where she was carrying his handkerchief and he was wearing her colors, and the whole city participated in this celebration of Florence, of this Giuliano, of this alliance, and of course of this beautiful woman. And it is following this joust, and I obviously inspiring all these humanist poets to create verse, that Bembo intensified his courtship of Ginevra and adopted her motto. I haven't shown it to you yet, but a symbol of her. And so one wonders whether Bernardo Bembo extended his alliance with Ginevra as a symbol of Venice, of the Venetian-Florentine alliance. So just look for a minute at some of these Simonetta images. One on the left by the Circle of Botticelli, and one particularly odd one that I had to show you by Piero di Cosimo, Portrait of a Woman, who has been identified as Cleopatra, Simonetta, or an unknown woman. And in both cases, both the Piero di Cosimo and the Botticelli Circle, we see this fascination or even obsession with hair. And this was a literary conceit that goes back to Boccaccio, Ovid, and Apuleius. I give you some quotes from Apuleius. As to the rest of her, I've nothing to say. It's only a woman's head and her hair that I'm really interested in. It's what I like to feast my eyes on, first in the street and then enjoy it in private indoors. Or Ovid talks about how Neptune fell in love with Medusa because of her hair, had sex with her in the temple of Minerva, which infuriated Minerva, who punished Medusa, turning her hair into a mane of snakes. I didn't know that. And then Lorenzo de' Medici talks about her white neck is enveloped by a braid, the hard chain of passionate lovers and the strong snare that never unties. And then from the opposite side of things, Savonarola in the end of the 15th century, look at the customs of Florence, how the Florentine women have married their daughters by taking them out to show and adorning them so as to resemble nymphs. So we have these very odd images of, I would propose to you, basically idealized or almost imaginary women, inspired perhaps by what Simonetta looked like. But I will remind you that she is dead by the time these paintings were produced. So if you look at the Botticelli one on the left, that braid that goes down and between her breasts is hair. And her hair is absolutely adorned with pearls and netting and feathers and rubies. She wears around her neck a cameo that was owned by the Medici. So we know that this is coming out of the Medici circle. The Piero di Cosimo is even stranger. That snake going around her neck gives me the creeps. But it's probably not identifying her as Cleopatra. It's not biting her, but it was also a symbol of the eternal cycle of life, the snake going around and biting its tail. And that's pretty much what that snake is doing, not biting the woman, but biting its own tail. And the snake was also a symbol of prudence, although I don't think this representation is particularly one of prudence. Her death might, if it's Simonetta or inspired by Simonetta, her death might be implied by that black cloud behind her hair. And of course, both of these images are probably inspired by images of Venus, which again brings up this very complex contradiction between a chaste Venus or the dangers of lust. And the inscription on the bottom has recently been confirmed as from the date, and it identifies this sitter as Simonetta, coming from Genoa, and connecting with the issue of time, and that snake would relate to that as well. So I hadn't mentioned that the Ginevra da Benci portrait by Leonardo is double-sided. Now, Leonardo did not paint the back, but it is there. And looking at these two sides, we have an indication that something has changed over time and that perhaps this was cut down, which has been confirmed. The other thing that is noticeable is that there's a strong influence of Northern painting in the way Leonardo depicts Ginevra, but also in the inclusion of the motto on the back. And I also include that Bembo met Ginevra at a friend's house, fell in love with her, and Ginevra didn't reject him. She dropped a violet on her way back from church, which was sent to Bembo by Cristoforo Landino. So this could be anecdote, could be true, but we certainly have documentation of a relationship between Bernardo Bembo and Ginevra. And Bembo, before coming to Florence, had been the Venetian ambassador in Burgundy from 1471 to 74. And in fact, owned the portrait of a man with a coin by Hans Memling that I show you, small, but with the blue sky behind his head. So if we look at the Roger van der Weyden portrait of a man with an open book, and the reverse of that, the back of that portrait, you see the holly branch with an inscription that says, "I hate things that sting." And then I also show you a Petrus Christus portrait of a young woman, which many people have compared to the portrait of Ginevra, particularly the kind of the pale skin and the slightly lowered eyelids. And then, of course, the Memling portrait of a man, you have an incredibly similar background that I think I have yes, if you look at these more closely, the way the figure is placed in front of the landscape is very similar in both cases. The difference with Ginevra is that juniper bush behind her head. If you were to remove the juniper bush, the setting would be incredibly similar. So that, in addition, connects Leonardo with knowing Bernardo Bembo and becoming familiar with Northern painting through his association with Bembo. And from X-rays of the painting of the back, they discovered that first on the surface you have the motto "Virtutum forma decorat," beauty adorns virtue, which we talked about, that the outer beauty reveals inner beauty. But underneath it, above, from an X-ray, it was discovered that the motto "virtue and honor" were beneath it. And that is Bembo's motto. And my image is blocking the Bembo's motto, which is found on the wall of Dante's mausoleum in Ravenna. And it seems that Bembo borrowed Ginevra's and then made it his own, cementing this Venetian-Florentine relation or alliance. So I show you Bernardo Bembo's motto adopted after 1480 in black and white in the lower right. And this is possibly also relating to Leonardo's fascination coming from Petrarch about which is better, the competition between literature, poetry, and painting. Answer yourself. Oh, this is from Petrarch when Laura returns from death to explain the meaning of the laurel and the palm, which you see in this motto. So you have a laurel branch and then a palm branch, and in the center, a juniper branch, the image of Ginevra. So Laura tells Petrarch, answer yourself, you whose pen so honors one of them. The palm is victory, and I, when still young, conquered the world and myself. The laurel means triumph, of which I am worthy, thanks to that Lord who gave me strength. So the inspiration for this motto on the back of Ginevra seems to come from Petrarch, with the laurel and the palm, and then her symbol of the juniper in the center. And Leonardo wrote quite extensively in his treatise on painting about the paragone, the competition between painting, sculpture, and poetry. And if the poet claims that he can inflame men to love, the painter has the power to do the same, and indeed more so, for he places before the lover's eyes the very image of the beloved object, and he often engages with it, kissing it and speaking with it, which he would not do were the same beauties placed before him by the writer. And so much the more does painting conquer the minds of men, to love and fall in love with a painting that does not portray any living woman. Now, that has caused people to say, is this person a real person? And with Leonardo, they are probably inspired by real people, Ginevra da Benci here, but he probably altered them to fit his ideal. And he brings us into their world, or brings them into our world. He dissolves the boundary between the woman behind this canvas and us. She's no longer enclosed in an interior space like we saw last week. And she is there fully accessible to us as a person with a mind. And I mentioned early on the influence of Verrocchio's studio. And I show you Verrocchio's portrait of a woman from about 1480, which is almost identical with Leonardo's painting. Are they the same woman? Is this how Leonardo was inspired by his training with Verrocchio? We may never know the answer to that. And I also show you reconstructions of what we believe Ginevra looked like before she was cut down. We don't know why she was cut down, but because of the Verrocchio sculpture, because of the existence of these drawing of hands that are in Windsor Castle by Leonardo, and through x-rays and through studying the base of the Ginevra, where it is clear that there has been abrasions, so she was cut. And if you look, if I go back for a second, if you look at the motto, the reverse of the painting, it's incomplete. We also see signs of damage at the bottom of the motto as well. So based on all these bits of evidence, she has been digitally reconstructed. And I show you what it is believed she looked like as a painting and what the motto looked like on the reverse. And it is a far more compelling painting when her arms are included and it's waist length, and it's no longer that kind of odd square, which is a very unusual shape for a portrait. And again, this relates to Leonardo's fascination with which is better, painting or sculpture. So you can imagine Leonardo coming out of Verrocchio's studio, Verrocchio doing this sculpted bust, and Leonardo doing what he would think was the superior painted version. And as we always see, Leonardo's works had enormous influence on painters who followed. And I show you a Lorenzo di Credi in the Met. And Lorenzo di Credi also came out of the Verrocchio workshop. His portrait of a young woman of about 1490, possibly also a Ginevra because of the bush behind her head, and possibly Ginevra di Giovanni di Niccolò, who was a goldsmith, and the widow of the artist's brother, and her crossed hands, the waist length or three-quarter length view, the landscape background. And then this other one, Agnolo di Domenico di Mazziere, portrait of a young woman, possibly reflects what Leonardo's Ginevra originally looked like. It's very similar clothing. Does this relate to the change in sumptuary laws, or is this Leonardo's influencing other artists, removing all the accoutrements of fashion? And it's also been suggested that Leonardo's drawing of a lady with a unicorn was possibly his first concept, because, and I think this is a bit of a stretch, because the drawing, the face of the woman in the drawing resembles Ginevra. Well, I think that's a bit of a stretch. Maybe Leonardo was thinking about this and presented this to the Benci or to Bernardo, and certainly we know that chastity was a huge issue, virtue for women. And when this was first examined as whether it was in fact by Leonardo, the strongest evidence was the similarity, was the curls of the hair. The similarity of the hair to his drawings of water, which you see, and also to the curls of his angel Annunciate from his Annunciation of a similar time. So let's go back to the evidence that the image presents us. Did Leonardo paint? When did Leonardo paint Ginevra? So Ginevra was a member of a convent, Le Murate, which housed many independent, strong-minded women. And she lived there before her marriage, but she also returned later. So did Leonardo paint her just before her marriage, which would explain why no marriage jewelry? Or perhaps did she retreat to the convent Le Murate in response to Bembo's pursuit? Or did she or her family change the motto, Bembo's motto, on the back to make it her own? All these questions may never be answered, but they're fascinating to consider. Also, if you scholars who have studied 15th century Florentine fashion have looked very closely at the Ginevra. And if you notice, she has a black veil or scarf around her neck, which is called the scapula, and possibly associates her with Le Murate, which was a convent in Santa Croce. Or another argument is this isn't a scapula, but rather a colleretto, which was mentioned in a 1464 sumptuary law as a permitted form of adornment. So I think that is more likely, although there were fascinating women who belonged to Le Murate, Caterina Sforza, Catherine de' Medici. It was a magnet for independent women. And you remember, she's a mountain tiger. So this all may involve both the Ginevras that you see on the screen, because of course the woman in black could also be associated with Le Murate, but she was also a widow, so she could be in mourning. And then I have to just mention the scholar who argues against her identity as Ginevra and de' Medici, and insists that she is Ginevra Sforza. So the first clue to her being Ginevra Sforza is if you look to her left behind her back, there seems to be an arch, pointed arch behind her. And I show you the Costa Gate from Sasso Corvaro, along with the River Foglia, which was destroyed in 1946. And it's was located near Pesaro, where Ginevra Sforza was raised. Ginevra Sforza was the illegitimate daughter of Alessandro Sforza, the ruler of Pesaro. And his coat of arms was the olive and the palm. So now we're going to go, is that a laurel or is that an olive? And in 1464, she married Giovanni II Bentivoglio, which I spelled wrong, and which was also in the 15th century, he was also called Bencivoglio. So, and was a friend of Leonardo. So the argument is perfectly understandable. And it hinges also on when you look at the motto as it's been digitally expanded, there's an awful lot of space underneath it. And this scholar has argued that is not the way a Renaissance painter would have painted a motto, and has suggested that Ginevra Sforza portrait was cut down in order to remove the coat of arms of Giovanni Bentivoglio, because in the early 16th century, when Julius II defeated Bologna and ran the Bentivoglios out of Bologna, perhaps Ginevra was cut down to remove that coat of arms. And I show you a portrait of Ginevra Sforza from later in her marriage. And one can decide. I am less convinced. I feel that the circle of Bernardo Bembo and the Medici makes more sense, but this is a perfectly reasonable argument. And I have to agree that this gap underneath the motto seems odd. Okay, there's our Ginevra. going about 15 years, Leonardo has moved to Milan in 1482 to work for the Sforza court. And there he paints a portrait of of a woman, Cecilia Gallerani. Everyone pretty much agrees that this is Cecilia, around 1490. Her father was the ambassador to Florence, so that again connects this into the world that Leonardo left behind. And she was an extraordinary woman, a poet, an intellectual, fluent in Latin, a musician, and a renowned singer. Beautiful, brilliant. And because of all that, she became the mistress of Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, who was the ruler of Milan, and she was his mistress from 1489 to 1492. In 1491, she gave birth to their son. They were not married, Cesare. Now, meanwhile, Ludovico is engaged to Beatrice d'Este, and he keeps putting off her arrival in Milan when he's supposed to marry her because of his affair with Cecilia. She comes, and as you can imagine, when Beatrice is married to Ludovico Sforza, she begins to complain about the presence of Cecilia living in the palace with her and her husband. So in 1492, 1 year after the birth of his illegitimate son, Cesare, Ludovico arranged for Cecilia to marry Ludovico Carminati di Brambilla and retire from Milan. Beatrice had her way, get her out of here. And one wonders whether this portrait was perhaps then given to her after, to take with her to when she left Milan. This is an amazing portrait that has also been altered over time, which we'll look at. But I wanted to give you another Leonardo anecdote about how he views portraits and how people view his portraits. Once I happened to be making a painting that represented a sacred figure that was bought by someone who fell in love with it. He wanted to remove the attributes of the saint so he would be able to kiss it without misgivings. But in the end, his conscience rose above his size and his lust, and he was forced to remove it from his house. Well, we do not think of portraits as kissable, although I have to admit something. When I was a little girl, I used to watch Lassie, black and white television, and I used to kiss the television when Lassie was barking at the end. So maybe as a little girl, I was no different than a Renaissance person kissing a portrait of a beloved. All right, so here I show you two things that are really interesting. One, it is known that at some point after Leonardo painted it, that an artist went in there and painted the background black. So I show you, this is the way she looks now. And from looking at the edges, it is known that originally the background was this kind of wonderful steely blue, which makes her far more three-dimensional and far more alive. In addition, from X-rays, it is known that Leonardo did not originally include the ermine, that it was kind of in three stages. He started first with the woman without an animal accoutrement and without a shawl over her shoulder. And then he had added in what looks like a weird weasel. And then finally, the weasel was transformed into an ermine. Now, this is a fascinating process. So one wonders, one thinks Ludovico asked Leonardo to paint Cecilia. And at first, he's just painting Cecilia. Then one wonders whether, because she had a son, whether all of a sudden Ludovico wanted a greater presence or some kind of a presence in this portrait. So let's see what all this means. And we know this probably occurred somewhere around 1490, because that's when Leonardo wrote Ludovico saying that he needed to take on additional projects to make money. So first of all, maybe I should go back here. First of all, she's incredible. And she's far more physically present and alive than Ginevra was. And you have this sense that she has just turned as someone walks into the room. And that someone most likely would be Ludovico. But also you're seeing that Leonardo develops an extraordinary relationship with the women he paints as well. The other thing, which we'll get to in a moment, is that extraordinary hand. And when Cecilia visited San Francisco, I have lost all track of time, 10 years ago, I stood and watched people come to see this Leonardo, and oh my God, it was a Leonardo, isn't it extraordinary, yada, da, da. But no one mentioned that hand. And that hand expresses, at least to me, so much. That imagine being the mistress of the Duke of Milan. You're in this incredibly public, important role. You know he's engaged to this prominent woman, Beatrice d'Este, who is going to come to Milan and marry your beloved. And you know then that your status is very uncertain. And that hand is so tense, elongated, and you just feel the tension of her position at court, which then she sent away. So I urge you to really look at that hand and think about the significance of that hand. I think it expresses so much about Leonardo's understanding of his sitter, of Cecilia. Okay, now let's begin with the second version, with the weasel. And I show you a childbirth tray. And I want to remind you, she's had that child, right? Cesare. And this childbirth tray depicts the birth of Hercules, which has a very strange story from Ovid. So Jupiter, you know, Jupiter's always going all over the place, screwing women. So Jupiter impregnates Alcmena. Juno, always jealous of Jupiter's behavior, angry, called on Lucina to prevent Alcmena from delivering her child. Alcmena endured 1 week of painful labor, not able to deliver her child. And finally, her servant, Galanthus, tricked Lucina by announcing, oh, the baby's born. So Lucina uncrossed her legs, which permitted Alcmena from delivering her baby, who was Hercules. Hera, or Juno, was furious at Galanthus for betraying her and disobeying her and uncrossing her legs, and turned her into a weasel, condemning her to give birth through her mouth. Odd. The weasel then, and you see this little weasel in the childbirth tray, the weasel became a talisman for pregnant women. And it was then continued to be the belief that the weasel, like the virgin, was impregnated through the ear. Notice that Cecilia's ear is covered. There's a weasel in version 2, perhaps celebrating the fact that she was pregnant at the time. But why then did Leonardo change the into an ermine? And I just show you one other, why did he change it into an ermine? And I show you a drawing by Leonardo of a hunter in ermine, which is in Cambridge, England. And he says, the ermine, out of moderation, never eats but once a day, and it would rather let itself be captured by hunters than take refuge in a dirty lair in order not to stain its purity. So the ermine became a symbol of chastity and purity, but more importantly, Ludovico il Moro was awarded the Order of the Ermine in 1488 from King Ferdinand I, and was after that known as l'Ermelino. So we have this wonderful progression from weasel fertility to ermine purity. So maybe Cecilia is cleaning up her reputation, or Leonardo is helping her improve her reputation. But more importantly, that ermine now becomes a symbol of Ludovico. And she is stroking it, and that ermine's paw is on the slash in her sleeve, which reveals red or passion. So all of a sudden, this becomes an incredibly rich and meaningful image that you would not, it takes a lot to decipher, that Leonardo is never obvious. And I just show you one other image from the 15th century of an ermine. This is from another birth tray, Desco de Parto, which is the triumph of chastity, inspired by Petrarch. It depicts the moment after the battle between love and chastity. Cupid is bound and kneeling there with his injured wing. Chastity behind him, standing, holds the palm of victory. And you have to look very closely at the woman in red on the far right carrying a banner, because on that banner is an ermine as a symbol of chastity. So all of this comes together to give us a greater sense of understanding of what is being represented. So we have the ermine being a symbol of Ludovico, but in addition, in ancient Greek, ermine or weasel was known as a galet, which then can be seen as a pun on her name, Gallerani. So Leonardo has incorporated all these different aspects into this painting of this vibrantly alive woman who was known so well in the court of Milan, brilliant and talented, and the subject of poetry, another one of these brilliant, beautiful women about whom humanists wrote poetry, and I have one here. Nature, who stirs your wrath, of whom you are envious, of Vinci, Leonardo, who has portrayed one of your stars, Cecilia, so very beautiful. Today is the one whose lovely eyes make the sun seem a dark shadow. The honor is yours, even though with his painting, she seems as if she would listen and not speak. Think only that the more alive and beautiful she remains, the greater will be your glory in every future age. Give thanks then to Ludovico and to the talent and hand of Leonardo, which permits you to participate in posterity. So we know from this poem, she is indeed Cecilia, painted by Leonardo, ordered by Ludovico. One more Leonardo portrait. It is now universally, I think, agreed upon as a Leonardo image, although it has been challenged over time. She's in the Louvre, known as La Belle Ferronniere, and a ferronniere is a jewel worn on her forehead. So the name comes from that jewel on her forehead. And scholars, of course, want to identify her. And she has been identified as three different women: Lucrezia Crivelli, who was the mistress of Ludovico Sforza from 1495 to 1499, or a poet, because if these women are going to be painted, they better be extraordinary, right? Which I'm not sure is accurate, Camilla Scarampa, or most likely, as you'll see, is this Beatrice d'Este, who finally was brought to Milan to marry Ludovico. So first, if she's Lucrezia Crivelli, she was a member of Beatrice's court, and she also gave birth to a son by Ludovico, and then escaped to Mantua when the French invaded in 1497, I think. So that isn't a whole lot of evidence to say this is Lucrezia Crivelli. Or again, if it's a poet, if she's an intellectual, this is her poem. I'm not going to read it to you because it doesn't identify this image. She had her own Academy of Poetry and Music. Perhaps that would have attracted Leonardo to her. But again, there's really no documentary evidence that this is Camilla Scarampa. More likely is that Ludovico would have commissioned a portrait of his wife, Beatrice. And I show you the Palace Sforzesca, by an anonymous painter in 1494. And there is Beatrice kneeling on the right in the striped dress. In the center is a portrait bust by Gian Cristoforo Romano of Beatrice d'Este from 1490. And I just show all these in comparison to Leonardo's image. And there seems to be a certain degree of similarity. I think Leonardo thinned her cheeks, but it just makes greater sense that this would be Ludovico's wife. And I also find it interesting that here he puts her behind a cornice or a window frame. And of course, a married woman is more controlled and more enclosed than a mistress in a way. So possibly that might identify her as Beatrice. And then from the circle of Leonardo, here's this wonderful drawing, which has been identified as Beatrice. And I think this rather cements that the most likely identification of the Belferoniere would be Beatrice d'Este. And then Leonardo, what time is up? I should probably, let me get through Isabella d'Este and then we'll take a break. So in 1499, when the French invade Milan, Leonardo runs from Milan and first goes to Venice and then to Mantua, where he lives at the court of Isabella d'Este, who desperately wants him to paint her portrait. And I show you a coin that she liked and another drawing by Leonardo of a portrait of a woman in profile. And then this sketch, this drawing, which is believed to be Isabella d'Este. It is known that he made several drawings of Isabella d'Este. One he took to Venice, and the other he left in Mantua, but was given away by her husband, Francesco. And she continued to pursue him as he went back to Florence and Rome, saying, I want this portrait. So there was one left in Mantua. This one on the right possibly was taken with Leonardo to Venice, and he never painted a portrait of Isabella d'Este, no matter how often she persuaded or reminded him. Then in the Ashmolean, there's a drawing copy after the Isabella d'Este drawing. Many times his workshop assistants and pupils made copies of the works as he was making them. And the one in the Ashmolean shows that there was more, of her arms and hands, that she rested her hands on a ledge. And it reminds us how he probably included the hands in the Ginevra da Benci. So Martin Kemp believes that the Louvre cartoon on the left was floating around and someone made a painted version, which you see on the right, which was discovered in a Swiss bank vault, has been accepted as Leonardo. I don't think any of us would accept this as a Leonardo, but rather that these copies were made in his studio and after the work that he made. And just before the break, it has also been proposed, I'm not going to go down this path, that the Mona Lisa is actually Isabella d'Este. But I would propose to you that if he had actually painted Isabella d'Este, there would have been documents. She would have written about it. So I don't think he could have painted her without her knowledge, and that she would have boasted extensively about it. So with that, we will take a break for like 5 minutes before looking at the Mona Lisa, which I'm going to go relatively quickly through so that we can look at all the later portraits as well. Okay. Yes. All right. Here are the chat questions. Was Simonetta the model for the birth of Venus? Probably, but it was painted after she died. So they just must have had images hanging around. And this was Botticelli's, he loved her, you know, she was famous throughout Florence. So I think she seems to have been the inspiration. If indeed that's Simonetta, She seems to have been the inspiration for a lot of Botticelli's paintings. On the previous slide, we're seeing that is pictured with a woman. The woman on the right has a peculiar dark line at the top of her neck. Oh, how am I going to see that? Hold on. I have to go back. Oh, it's a cord, probably. Oh, you mean under her chin? There's a strange one under. I think it's all tying various things from her hairdo. And if you look carefully, actually at Cecilia, it looks like her hair is tied under her neck, and it was just this transparent kind of bonnet around her neck. So there are strange things coming from hair ties. The hands, whose hands look as if they belong to a male? Whose hands? Ginevra's or Cecilia's? I agree that Cecilia's is a very strange hand, but I'm not sure I think it's a male hand. Do I ever do tours? Well, we've got COVID still hanging around. I haven't been to Europe in a couple of years. I'm going this spring. I think about it occasionally. Perhaps the first thing to do would be maybe go someplace in America. What animal is she holding? You mean Cecilia? She's holding an ermine, and before that, a weasel. Again, the hand. Are we talking about Cecilia's hand? Many hands are gnarly. Okay, so let me share the screen. Desktop, share. All right, that hand, is that what we're talking about? I completely agree. It's a very strange hand, but I think it is hers, which has been accentuated in a way, I believe, for Leonardo to express probably her tension at being just a mistress and without permanent status. But that's just a hypothesis. And there's Beatrice with no hands. And here, again, the hands are very much like the ones in Cambridge, the drawing in Cambridge. And here you see, these are just bad pictures. In the drawing, it's abraded, so you can't really judge the quality of the hand. But if you look at the drawing copy, it looks like he puts a lot of emphasis on her hands. And we're going to see that when we look at the Mona Lisa. Is it okay for me to start?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, so let's turn to the Mona Lisa. I show you the one on the left is what you would see if you went to the Louvre. And the one on the right has been digitally cleaned. They're terrified to clean her. But boy, would it be wonderful if they actually did clean her and you had blue sky rather than kind of musty, greeny, yellow sky. And notice how much more three-dimensional and full of life she appears in the cleaned version. So people have, I showed you, people have said she's Isabella d'Este. I don't think that's accurate. And there seems to be no longer controversy over her identity, thank God, because recently, in the last 5 years, there were discovered notes in the margins of a manuscript of Cicero's letters. These notes were margin notes, date from about 5 years. It is possible that they were written, part of them were written by Amerigo Vespucci. And it says, Apelles the painter, thus Leonardo does in all his paintings, as in the head of Lisa del Giocondo, 1503. What this refers to is Apelles always started with the face and the hands, and later turned to the body and the clothing. And the note says, so too did Leonardo, which makes sense. He's going to start with the face, where, soul. And we know he was not as interested in clothing. What's interesting is it seems that this painting, if she is indeed Lisa Gherardini, wife of Francesco del Giocondo, was never delivered to Francesco del Giocondo. They were married in 1495. That's quite before the painting, and then went on to have 5 children, a daughter who died in 1499, a son was born in 1502, and in 1503 they bought a house. Before that, they'd been living with his parents. So not so different than what goes on here in today's world. So it's believed that this might have been commissioned in celebration of the buying of the house and the birth of the son. Okay, hold on. And I show you what I find a rather creepy workshop copy, but again, to remind you that Leonardo would work on one and his associates in the workshop would create copies at the same time. And they would look different, but sometimes these copies give us a little bit more information about things like what she's wearing, what the location is, the background, and the setting. And here in the copy, you can see that she is wearing a transparent veil and kind of over the shoulder shawl, which has been identified in a multitude of ways with pregnancy and postpartum at-home clothing. But it seems that Leonardo is including that to kind of diminish the specificity of the garment. Okay. And I love giving you quotes from Leonardo because it gives us insight to his mind and his process. Time will destroy the harmony of human beauty in a few years, but this does not occur with such beauty imitated by the painter, because time will long preserve it, and the eye, in keeping with its function, will derive as much true pleasure from depicted beauty as from the living beauty denied to it. Okay, so why was this not ever delivered? Leonardo never could finish it, possibly. He took it with him. It ended up with him in France, which is why it's in the Louvre. Or is it possible that Francesco del Giocondo didn't like it? And that could be because it suppressed all signs of wealth, which were customary to Florentine paintings. People have been always most fascinated by her smile. And just like the ermine was a symbol of Cecilia and Lodovico, it has been suggested that this mysterious smile, which kind of makes us wonder about what she's thinking about, is she beginning to smile or finishing her smile, is perhaps a pun on her name, Giocondo, which means joyfulness and happiness. So again, the other comments about is why is she in this dark, boring, dull clothing? It's not dissimilar from Ginevra. It is different than Cecilia. That was a court lady, so that he was probably required to paint more elaborate clothing. And the more I have been studying this, the more I believe that this is Leonardo suppressing what he thinks are distractions from a woman's beauty. And he took it with him and he worked on this picture for 20 years. And it's very likely that it retreated in a way from being a portrait of an individual to being an image of an ideal. And he may have reduced the specificity of the costume. And it is a fascinating study of dualities. So if you look at her hands, again, let's look at her hands. One hand is relaxed and the other one is tense. So he's showing movement, inner movement through the display of her hands. Her body is turned, she looks toward us. And that body, the turn of the body is accentuated by the movement of the background. And I think I have in a couple of slides, people have tried to identify the specificity of the background. I think it's highly unlikely that Leonardo would care about a specific background. So is that bridge a specific bridge? I doubt it. I think his backgrounds reveal kind of the beginnings of the world, the beginnings of nature, the power of nature, like many of his drawings of storms. And it's that movement and the creativity, or the creation of the world through God, the creation of the woman. And she as a kind of earth goddess. But notice that the road goes back as her shoulder goes back, and the water flows toward us as her shoulder is turned toward us. So she is at one with the emerging landscape behind her. And I show you some other versions. The Ilsworth Mona Lisa, again, he may have begun this, or someone in his workshop began this, and Raphael may have popped into his workshop, seen this, and made this drawing based on his work. And because it's known from Lamazzo that there were two portraits, one of Mona Lisa and one of La Gioconda. Whatever that means, who knows? It probably means one by the hand of Leonardo and one in his studio. And this, it's possible that one he left with his pupil and lover Salai, and that Salai then sold that to Francis I, and that there was a second, maybe this Ilsworth, which is a very odd looking picture to me, was commissioned by Giuliano de' Medici and taken to France by Leonardo. So we don't know which is which, but we know there were multiple versions. Now, if we leave the kind of eternal image of, and the famous image of the Mona Lisa, and we turn to what the influence of Leonardo, I show you Raphael's portrait of Maddalena Doni. And we see how very different it is when it's not painted by Leonardo, and how the interests and concerns of the patron or the sitter come into play. So Leonardo was so famous and had the authority to change the norm of portraiture, both influences how later artists would paint, but could ignore the desires perhaps of the patron because of his fame. Here, Raphael is working for a very important family, the Doni family, and obviously needed to show the influence of Leonardo, the famous Leonardo, but also attend to the desires of the patron. So this was a double portrait of Agnolo on the left and Maddalena Strozzi Doni, from a very powerful and wealthy Florentine family. And Agnolo was a Florentine textile merchant as well as an art patron. And the reason I show you Donatello's mysterious Amor Artis on the right is that it was commissioned or owned by Agnolo Doni. So Agnolo knew his artists. He commissioned works from Raphael, Michelangelo, as you see, and acquired works from Donatello. They were married on January 31st in 1504. And in 1506, he started remodeling his palace, and in 1506, their marriage chamber was complete. She, meanwhile, had suffered several miscarriages before the birth of her first child in 1507, and then her second in 1508. So we believe that this portrait was probably commissioned like the Mona Lisa in celebration of the completion of the palace. On the back, so again, we're looking at the back of portraits, which the images on the back were painted by different artists. Here we know it was painted by a friend of Raphael, Maestro di Cerumido, and it's chiaroscuro, so it's kind of a ink and gouache back. And it depicts two passages or two episodes from Ovid's Metamorphoses. One, it shows the flood on the back of Agnolo, and on the back of Maddalena, it shows the myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha. And these are allegories of fertility and marriage. Deucalion and Pyrrha were elderly, had no children, and they saved themselves, or were saved from the flood, and then were told to throw stones over their shoulders, which turned into people. So you can imagine that suffering several miscarriages, there was a huge desire for repopulation or for having children, and that this related to their desire for a family. And it is known now that these two portraits were initially hinged, and with the images on the back, so would close and open like a book. And in celebration of their first child, they commissioned Michelangelo's Doni Tondo, which is a Uffizi. And I love this passage from Vasari. Whilst he was living in Florence, Agnolo Doni, who was very careful with his money on other things, but willing to spend, although still with the greatest possible economy, on works of painting and sculpture, in which he much delighted, asked Raphael to make portraits of himself and of his wife. So we know that I love this, you get a little insight into this man on the left. And one is rather, I find Maddalena rather intimidating. She's not someone I'm longing to sit and chat with. But she, again, if you think of these portraits of women, they are there to display the wealth and the power of the family, of Doni family and the Strozzi family. And her jewelry is definitely marriage jewelry. We'll look at it closely in a moment. This pair of images relate to each other through the landscape. It's probably looking out over the Tuscan landscape where they had a villa, and showing without question the influence of Leonardo, but we're in a completely different world. And here I show you the jewelry, this incredibly large pendant with a unicorn setting. It's hard to see. There's a unicorn above, a symbol of chastity. The emerald was believed to be beneficial for health, the sapphire for a symbol of purity, and the ruby, prosperity and strength, and the pearl, virginity. So in a funny way, this pearl is somewhat like the ermine, showing the chastity and virginity, ideal virginity of the wife, although also fertile. So very odd, how can you be fertile and chaste at the same time? And she displays on her hands the three rings that were allowed in Florentine sumptuary law, and this very massive pendant. And I show you the Doni Tondos, which is in its original frame and was commissioned to celebrate the birth of their first child. And I relate it in its shape to a desco de parto, a birth tray. And the one on the left was painted for the birth of Lorenzo de' Medici. And just showing you the kind of images that were commissioned to celebrate a birth, to celebrate a marriage. We're not going to discuss the Doni Tondo except very briefly. It could only be painted by Michelangelo. Those figures are so sculptural. Everything is about the ideal form of the circle, an image of divinity and perfection. So you have the Holy Family in the foreground. You have a wall, a little guy on the right looking up towards the Holy Family. He is the young John the Baptist, and he's in between the age of Christ, the Old Testament, and those nudes in the background, I believe, are symbols of the pagan world. So you have the three ages, the pagan, the Old Testament, and the New Testament. Now, Raphael, as we saw actually, when you look at Maddalena Doni, she's not the most beautiful in the world. So you don't think Raphael is always idealizing his women. And here, I still have trouble imagining that Raphael painted Elisabetta Gonzaga on your left. But I had to include this because it is fascinating about the power of images and what was included as meaning in an image. So first of all, you've seen many of these portraits with women with their eyes lowered. And I mentioned this last week too, that women's gaze was powerful and frightening, and it aroused a man's desire. And San Bernardino said, bury your eyes. And so for a proper woman, she was supposed to have downcast eyes. I show you a medal of Elisabetta Gonzaga, but more importantly, I have to tell you a little bit about them. So she married Guidobaldo da Montefeltro in 1489. His portrait is on the right. And it is known that he was impotent and had no heirs. He actually had, the heir to him was adopted Francesca Maria della Rovere. But she refused to leave him or have her marriage annulled. She was loyal to him despite his impotence. And we know from a letter from Pietro Bembo, son of Bernardo, Signor Guido Ubaldo, due to a defective nature, or more likely, as was believed, because of spells, could not in the course of his life know a woman carnally, not even in marriage. And Pope Alexander VI wanted to dissolve the marriage, but Elisabetta remained devoted and loyal. And we're going to see something that relates to her in this portrait. If you look closely, notice that she has a band around her forehead and with a peculiar metal or peculiar object on this band. And as you will see, it is a scorpion. Castiglione described her in The Courtier. Now I must say a word about our Duchess, who has lived with her husband for 15 years like a widow, and who has not only steadfastly refused to tell this to anyone in the world, but after being urged by her own people to escape from this widowhood, chose rather to suffer exile, poverty, and all kinds of hardship than to accept what seemed to everyone else a great favor and indulgence of fortune. So this harsh-looking woman is being praised by Bembo, by Castiglione. And here I show you a close-up of the scorpion amulet on her forehead, a very odd thing to wear around your forehead. But it was a fertility amulet. And so everything about her, this image painted possibly by Raphael, is relating to the troubles of her life. That she is shown as chaste with that pseudo-Kufic script, referencing the Virgin, the symbol of the scorpion, which united life and death, as we'll see, and was used as something for fertility. So I'm actually not, this is on your outline. This is Marsilio Ficino talking about Scorpio. We're not going to read this now. Feel free to read it as at your leisure. But what I want to talk to you about or share with you is the beliefs and the power of the scorpion and the sign of Scorpio. So according to Ptolemy in his Tetrabiblos from the 2nd century, Scorpio was a polyspermon which enriches and sows. It looked over agricultural fecundity, was connected with Aries, and Aries, it was believed, governed genital organs, and thus associated with the illnesses of melancholy, hemorrhoids, and tumors. So I show you the Durer syphilic under the sign of Scorpio. Okay, there is the illness, but I also show you a guild book of the barbers' surgeons from the second half of the 16th century, and there is Scorpio on the left with a line connecting it to the penis. So Paracelsus, from around 1500, the Renaissance physician, advised that a scorpion talisman be worn by those suffering from problems with the reproductive system. So now, do I go back to her? Now we understand why this woman, Elisabetta Gonzaga, is wearing a scorpion around her head. These are fascinating things that, you know, as you wander a museum and you look at this portrait of a not very beautiful woman, but you go, why? And so it took a little bit of digging, but I think it's fascinating to see how these images relate to the individual and perhaps was believed to have powers themselves. And just along the lines of fertility objects included in portraits, I show you on the right a Boltraffio. He was a pupil or follower of Leonardo, a woman with a scorpion chain. It's around her chest. And it has been identified possibly as Anne Lascaris, who was born under the sign of Scorpio. So we don't know whether Anne Lascaris had fertility issues or just showing her birth sign. And the Bernardino Luini portrait on the left of a lady, possibly Madeleine of Savoy, daughter of the woman with the scorpion chain, who married the gentleman in the center, Anne de Montmorency, who has a gold, because she's wearing a gold Maltese cross. But what I want you to see is she's holding in her hand a weasel pelt called the Zibellino, which was popular with brides as a talisman for fertility, which goes back to the myth of the birth of Hercules. And of course, the green curtain behind her could also relate her to her hoped for fertility. We're also going to see that this was a hat or a headdress that was associated with Isabella d'Este. But first, let's look at one of Raphael's beautiful women, also holding a strange animal in her lap, the portrait of a lady with a unicorn from 1505 to 6. It has been restored and cleaned, and the overpainting had changed her from this woman with a unicorn to an image of St. Catherine. So in the 30s, the restoration removed the wheel, which she holds, and revealed the unicorn. And then in 59, X-ray revealed that before it was a unicorn, it was a dog, Fidelity. And then already in the 17th century, it was not known who the artist was or who the sitter was. So we relate this to the influence of Leonardo on Raphael. I show you again the sketch, which was based on the Mona Lisa or versions of the Mona Lisa, or possibly a now lost cartoon by Leonardo before he began the painting of the Mona Lisa. And again, I show you the lady with the unicorn, this beautiful blonde, and I show you a Raphael Madonna and Child, the small cowper Madonna, which relates to your question with Simonetta, the inspiration for the birth of Venus. I think these artists had their favorite models and then reused them and slightly altered them in religious paintings. So here we have the display of Mona Lisa in the Louvre, various versions, and the Raphael, which again, shows that possibly the Mona Lisa was originally in, or his concept was to place her in a balcony with columns. And so all of these versions, including Raphael, may be understood as improving on Leonardo. And I had to share this with you because this I just recently uncovered. The director of the Borghese Gallery, where the lady with the unicorn hangs, Anna Coliva, identifies the lady with the unicorn as Maddalena Strozzi. Now, these two paintings date to more or less the same time, and I don't see how in any stretch of the imagination you can think that the lady with the unicorn is the same as the portrait of Maddalena Strozzi. I'll leave that to you to discuss and think about, but I can't see how they could be the same person. But according to another art historian, Linda Wilkes-Simon, she looking at the drawing by Raphael, she was focused on the background and identified that tower. It's a little hard to be specific, but identified as San Francesco in Urbino. So if indeed the background to this painting is Urbino, she proposed the identity of Laura Orsini della Rovere, who was born in 1492, daughter of Giulia Farnese, sister of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, later Paul III, and mistress of Alexander VI Borgia. We knew he was naughty and he liked blondes. So now we're looking at this very pure, chaste image of a beautiful woman young woman who was possibly the mistress of Alexander Borgia. So let's dig a little deeper and see what we can come up with. According to Vasari, in the palace, he, Pinturicchio, also portrayed over the door of one of the living rooms, Signora Giulia Farnese, that would be the mother of Laura, in the features of Our Lady, and in the same picture, the face of Pope Alexander, who is adoring the Madonna. All right, so Cardinal or Pope Alexander Borgia is there kneeling. This is a later 17th century copy, adoring a virgin who supposedly has the face of Laura, Giulia Farnese, who is the mother of Laura Orsini, or hold on, I have to remember, Laura Orsini della Rovere. Okay. So, and then I show you a 16th century painting of a lady with a unicorn, which is believed also to be Giulia Farnese, called La Bella Farnese, Alexander's official mistress. Oh, I made a mistake. So the blonde is not his mistress. Her mother is the mistress of Alexander Borgia. So we're getting Borgia, mother, unicorn. And we're learning also that the Farnese family adopted the unicorn as a heraldic emblem in the 15th century. And Giulia, mother of Laura, adopted it as a personal device. So I show you all these unicorns that are found in the decoration of Farnese palaces, the Rocca Farnese in Carboniano, and the Castello di Vassanello, Salone on the right. So this identification is making some sense. If she is Laura Orsini della Rovere, daughter of, well, I'm having real problems with these names, daughter of Giulia Farnese, it would make sense to have the unicorn included. And indeed, Laura wed in 1505 Niccolo Franciotti della Rovere, who was the nephew of Julius II, with an enormous dowry. And the ceremony was performed in the Sala dei Pontifici, adjoining the Borgia apartments. And this created a strategic alliance between the Orsini family, Roman patricians, and Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. And the castle that I showed you in the previous slide was decorated on the occasion of that marriage with all those unicorns. So was this image by Raphael commissioned to celebrate their engagement? Red and white are Orsini colors. The unicorn is a symbol of the Farnese, which had been adopted by her mother. Pearl, hanging between her breasts, a symbol of virginity and purity, and rubies, as we saw with Maddalena Strozzi, prosperity and fertility. So is this a portrait or is it an idealized version? I don't think we'll ever know, but certainly this more recent identification as Laura Orsini della Rovere makes sense, especially with the discovery of a description of her mother Giulia's Farnese's jewels, in which there's a description of a ruby and pearl pendant very similar to this one hanging. So I just find it fascinating how scholars unearth identities and argue about who they are, and then we can have the fun of deciding which makes sense. Now, this is one of my favorite paintings. And I've told this story before, but I've got more details to come. So Raphael's Donna Volata is believed to have been his lover, possibly his wife, secret wife. And I think we just want to start looking at this image before we start with all the ancillary evidence. It is an incredibly complex image that balances the ideal, beautiful, triangular, poised and slightly remote, with the real. You feel her presence. You feel you can almost reach out and touch her. She's engaging us. She's speaking to us and reminding us that we are in a relationship. But it's this incredibly complicated one where she's sensuous and beautiful and evocative, but also kind of withdrawn and chaste and virginal. So just as the ideal of a Renaissance bride was supposed to be fertile and chaste, this is what we see in this image. And Raphael has captured that complexity incredibly. And that sleeve is one of the most beautiful passages of paint ever painted. It is physical. You can just, it projects into our space. We can feel the satin and the complexity of the sleeve, which was a valuable object in itself. So I've always been drawn to this sleeve in this portrait. And then when I was reading about Judy Chicago, I'm looking at Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, which is now in Brooklyn, but I saw it in 1976 or 77 when it was in San Francisco. And I was looking at this, and then I went to give a lecture about the Donna Volati, and I went, oh my God, the sleeve and those plates, whoa. But I thought, of course, this would be unconscious. Raphael is not painting a vagina on this beautiful woman's sleeve, his lover. So that was my American Puritan cleaning up any kind of overt sexuality in a beautiful painting. But I went on, and then, and here's the detail. I hope you see why one reminded me of the other. And then I went on to read about Raphael by Vasari. Meanwhile, pursuing his amours in secret, Raphael continued to divert himself beyond measure with the pleasures of love. Whence it happened that, having on one occasion indulged in more than his usual excess, he returned to his house in a violent fever. Blah, 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 he dies. So we know he was amorous. Even Agostino Chigi talked about, Raphael's always playing around. I had to move in his mistress so he would finish painting my villa. Now, the most recent thing I discovered were these objects, which are called secular badges. They were believed to be apotropaic, worn to ward off disease, particularly evil vanquishing power of genitalia. And this beliefs about the power of the genitalia goes back to the 5th century Greece, but they were also exchanged and given as love tokens. So that means pilgrims were wearing vaginas and penises on their clothes as they went on pilgrimages. So just a fascinating discovery of the presence of vaginal imagery in the 15th century. And then many years ago, there was an exhibit of love and beauty and marriage in the Renaissance at the Met. And there was a room that was basically pornographic and gave a warning, children don't enter. And there I came face to face with this very large engraving after a drawing by Francesco Salviati of the triumph of the phallus. And I just looked there and went, wow, I have been American prude, that the Renaissance was a really sexy time. And these guys were, having multiple affairs and yet expecting their wives to be chaste. Fascinating reality. And so I took a detail of this 16th century drawing and compared it to Raphael's Donna Volata. And I think we get the sense that what Raphael is showing is this complex duality between overt sensuality and sexuality, and this desired, idealized, chaste, virginal bride. And it is such an amazing combination that you really have to kind of almost dissect it and then allow it to come back together so that she can remain this glorious image of a complex woman. And compare her to Raphael, but probably finished by Giuliano Romano after his death, Raphael's death, of La Fornarina. Which is sexier? Which is more sensual? I always will be drawn to the Donna Volata because of the complexity. And it's often believed that women are more sensual when they are scantily clad than when they are nude. And Is this the same woman? I think it's the same woman, but they look different because of the harsher style of Giulio Romano. And then, does a woman inspire an artist? I show you just a screen full of Raphael's beautiful women that all seem to be the same women from when he was working in Rome. And we come back to this Fornarina, who is traditionally identified as Margherita Luti from Siena, who was the widowed daughter of Francesco Luti. And after Raphael's death, she entered a convent for fallen women. So was she secretly married to him? Was she his mistress? Or any of these? But notice around her upper arm, it says she belongs to Raphael, probably added by Giulio Romano. And the title La Fornarina, which I'm not sure from what period it dates, probably from the 16th century, that name carries erotic associations, 16th century erotic associations. Aretino, naughty boy, referred to ovens as metaphors for heterosexual intercourse. For every 2 people who bake their bread at home, there are 700 who want theirs from the bakers. It's whiter. And Giovanni della Casa said the warm baker's oven in which the soft bread rises and gets hard. So there is really sexual humor and erotic humor in the Renaissance that sometimes we Americans and Brits too miss. And notice that she wears a ring on her finger and that band around her upper arm. She has been many times identified as a courtesan, I think because of the erotic nature of this painting. And behind her also, it's hard to see, is a laurel, which would relate her to Petrarch's Laura. And so again, these complex dualities that exist in Renaissance paintings that are hard for 20th and 21st century Americans and Brits to really embrace and understand. Now moving on to, oh my goodness, I'm running out of time again. I want to show you a beautiful portrait by Andrea del Sarto, Portrait of a Lady with a Book, which then throws us into the world of the revival of Petrarch, because she's holding a volume of Petrarch and displaying 2 sonnets, sonnet 153 and 154, which are also on your outline. And, you know, as art historians are wont to do, they want to try and identify this woman. I don't think it's necessary. She's probably a woman named Laura, or she's showing these beautiful sonnets to her betrothed, to her lover, to her husband. She is incredibly present. You see the influence of Raphael and Leonardo in the work of Andrea del Sarto. I'm not going to read these sonnets to you because we're running out of time, but I just wanted to give you a sense of Andrea del Sarto and his approach to representing women, and how he too uses this woman that he may love, may know, in his images of secular women, as well as in his images of the Virgin. And remember, at the beginning of our first class, we talked about this ideal image of the Virgin Mary as the ideal for Renaissance women. Now, looking at 2 works by Giulio Romano, the one on the left, the portrait of Isabella de Vicenza, which Raphael sent Giulio to Naples. Remember, Giulio was in Raphael's workshop to paint Isabel, and then Raphael completed the face. So it's interesting again to see how a workshop operated. And then it was sent by Leo X as a gift to Francis I, who will meet next week, who collected portraits of beautiful women. And then this very odd portrait with a very ostentatious dress. You might understand what Leonardo believed, that too much dress detracted from a woman's beauty or distracted from a woman's beauty or lack of, was identified as Isabella d'Este because of that headdress, but now it is identified as Margherita Paleogolo, who married Isabella's son. So given that, I show you Giulio Romano's portrait of a woman at her toilette, and typically identified as a courtesan. But look at that face. Is that face the same as Margherita's face? Was this commissioned as a marriage for the bridal chamber, because Margherita was engaged to Federico II Gonzaga? She died, and he ultimately, no, excuse me. He married Margherita, but he was engaged to her sister Maria, who died, and then he took on Margherita. So maybe he wasn't in love with her, and maybe Giulio Romano, who painted all sorts of very erotic imagery for Federico II Gonzaga in the Palazzo del Te. So this is not a courtesan, but maybe it's an image for the marriage chamber. Oh, okay. How am I going to get through these and combine this with Medici portraits? I'm going to have to do some juggling, but let's just, if you can give me 5 more minutes, I think this is a fabulous portrait to end with. Parmigianino's Schiavaturca, called Schiavaturca for really no reason. Possibly the title was given to it in the 18th century and led scholars to identify her as Giulia Gonzaga on the occasion of her marriage to Vespasiano Colonna, because in 1534, Giulia Gonzaga was threatened with abduction by a Turkish invader, Barbarossa, to add her to Suleiman's harem. Well, no, there's no reason to imagine she is Giulia Gonzaga, and the fact that Schiava, Turkish slave title, was given to it in the 18th century, probably because of the ostrich feather and the turban. So she's wearing an elaborate gown, holding an ostrich fan, and has an amazing turban on her head. And we're going to see more about that turban. These are drawings that Parmigiano made, possibly for this portrait, that show her crowned with laurel leaves. So does that indicate possibly that she might have been a poet? And if we look closely at her headdress, there is a medal in the center of her headdress with a winged horse. Now that winged horse could be Pegasus, or it could be Aganippe. So Aganippe was described as a gentle horse crowned by a muse on Mount Helicon. The sanctuary of Cupid was at the foot of Mount Helicon, according to Pausanias. So in either case, if it's Pegasus, Apollo's muse, or Aganippe, it relates it to poetry. And I show you Pietro Bembo, son of Bernardo, medal, which on the reverse had Pegasus as the inspiring winged horse. So as we said, the winged horse could refer either to Pegasus or Aganippe. And this poem, attributed to Veronica Gambara, the glorious age of antiquity had Sappho and Corinna, who with their learned pens rose to the lovely light of the heavens by many worthy and virtuous roots. Now 2 ladies, whose locks are crowned with laurel and goodness, not only make Aganippe gush forth once more, but extinguish every false and wrongful habit with their splendid, eternal, unique, and rare deeds. So it is very possible that this is an image of a poet, possibly Veronica Gambara. And if we look closely at her costume, look at how there's gold chains within the sleeve, the power of love to enchain its victim, love enchained to chastity, not a style, no function, but they're evoking an association. And the ostrich feathers maybe a pun, which we know Renaissance artists used, on the pen, a visual pun for the pen of this poetess. And I compare this portrait by Parmigianino to Raphael's portrait of Castiglione. And in fact, Parmigianino was often described as the new Raphael. So who is she? I think it has been properly or effectively, she's been effectively identified as the poet Veronica Gambara, who was close to such figures as Isabella d'Este, whose portrait by Titian is shown in smaller form, and that kind of turban headdress was popular in the court of Isabella d'Este. And like Isabella d'Este required Titian to youthen her, because that portrait by Titian was painted when Isabella d'Este was about 60. So she didn't want to see what she really looked like. And we think that Parmigianino also youthened his image of Veronica Gambara. And I'm showing you images of Isabella d'Este and a portrait, also all these headdresses which were popular in the court of Isabella d'Este. Okay, I think I need to stop. I'm going to learn how to shorten my lectures, I guess. Let me do this and see if there are any chats. 8, okay. All right, where are we? Oh, dose and educational tours in San Francisco? Sure, I can do that. I don't think there are any Renaissance ones coming. No, the Tudor one is going to Cleveland. Something's coming soon to San Francisco, but I can't remember what it is. Oh, the wispy tree behind Madalena, I don't think there's significance to it. I think it's giving a sense of the landscape. Well, you could argue it was her duty to bear children, so there was no dwelling on lust, just a function of nature. Okay. Yes, that is believed that Julia was the daughter of Alexander and Laura. Exactly. Thank you for I kept getting confused of Julia and Laura. You've got it absolutely right. Raphael's composition makes sense if she was his mistress wife. Yes, exactly. And what we're going to find out when we look at some marriage images, that these very sensual paintings, sometimes overtly sexual, were destined for the marriage, the bedroom. But we have to remember, in the Renaissance, the bedroom was semi-public. It was like the great room. So I think there was, people lived in much closer proximity if you weren't living in a palazzo. And so I think there was a much greater comfort, perhaps, with sexuality than we have developed in the 18. Thank you, Queen Victoria. Victorian era going forward. Yes, Margarita Lutti looks like Madame Recamier. Would upper class women in the 15th century pose nude, or are those bodies of another lower class woman or mistress? Very possibly. Yes, I would say unlikely that the patrician woman would pose nude for the artist. But that does not mean they were not represented as nude, but probably you're right that the nude body was not theirs. Any other questions? And I apologize again, there were a whole lot of later 16th century portraits. I'll try and weave them in to other classes. Okay. All right. I think it's time and to bid adieu.